My name's Alex. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Taxfix. Joined about 3 years ago. Been experimenting and obsessed with experimenting for a long, long time. And today, we're going to talk about experimentation and why it's great. I'm kind of obsessed with the topic. I'm a bit biased, so bear with me if you're not that into processes. For me, this is a lot of fun. Now, over the years, I've been asking myself, what's really rewarding learning? What's helped me help companies I work for grow? Or it's helped companies I've been working with myself or as an advisor grow. And there's some learnings that are very rewarding. Today we're going to go through the experimentation learnings that I've had. What has really made the difference between some companies staying sort of flat, some growing like crazy, and some, well, it gets much worse than that. And seen a couple of companies on the inside, but also been advising several over time, all kinds of industries, mobile gaming, fintech, but also transportation, mobility, also B2B. And there's some patterns among all of this. And today we're going to go through those patterns. Now, is there a way to get the slides on the screen down here? Because it's black, that would help me. So what I'm going to go through today, as I said, companies big, small, companies young, old, companies with tons of money, companies with no money, and seen a lot of patterns. Today we're going to go through 4 patterns that I think apply across the board. And there's way more, but I personally think these are the ones that you can't really find online. You're learning, you're reading books, you're listening to people, and you go like, hey, I'm not hearing about this stuff. In hindsight, I've made so many mistakes on this stuff that I wish I knew this beforehand. Now, pattern number 1, copy-pasting what other companies do without the critical thinking. I think my favorite sentence is, we should do it like Booking.com does. I think I've been hearing that one for about 10 years now. Maybe there's a new company coming up. That often happens. Pattern number 2, build the process and they will come. There's a saying, you build the product and they will come. A lot of us know that doesn't necessarily work. It's kind of the same with the process, but it's got some nuances. Pattern number 3, it's one of my favorites, is you ask some people why we should experiment in the first place. Answers are not that great. Got Mark in the back here, one of my team members. He knows how that goes. Pattern number 4 is you don't have somebody obsessed. You might tell by the end of this presentation, I tend to be that person. In my current role, I have to delegate it, but time and time again, I've been that obsessed person, and I never read anywhere, you need somebody that's obsessed about this stuff. So let's get into it. There's a starting point. I started somewhere. I had no clue what I was doing good 7, 8 years ago. This is where I started. So you got your typical stuff that you can read, like Reforge. I think 25 IQ is actually worth pointing out. It's not very well known, but it taught me a lot about software technology and how growth and experimentation are linked to each other. Then you've got your super experts that you can find all over the place that just know way more than most people in the industry about their fields. Following them, reading them, really worth it. There's a bunch of books. Don't underestimate the statistics books. I'm not that good at statistics. I passed it in uni, but I realized afterwards I should have paid more attention, had to go back, read a bunch of books on mathematics, statistics, data science, but also product engineering, marketing kind of helps. Then you got to listen to mathematicians and statisticians. So when you're talking with them, they say a bunch of things about what's not feasible. You should probably listen because it makes a lot of sense instead of trying to force some experiment that you finish and then afterwards you have no clue what actually happened. So listen to the statisticians and the mathematicians. They actually know much, much more than you think they know. And last but not least, there's a bunch of perspectives that just flow into experimentation. One of them we'll go into in a second, which is change management and how that can actually help in a small company or a medium-sized company, not just a big company. This is my starting point. I'd say this is about 30% of what you need to know to build something that's very good. Now, there's another 70%, which comes through doing it yourself, trying it yourself, failing, succeeding sometimes, but more often failing than succeeding. And at some point, it starts to become more often succeeding than failing. I think I'm halfway. So I'd say today I'm at 60% knowledge. I've got another 40% or so to go. Maybe if I ever work at Booking.com, I'll find out this magical Booking.com solution, but I think I've still got a lot to learn. Today, I think I'll try and share from that 70% trial and error, the first 30% that I've learned, some of the patterns that I showed earlier. So, pattern number 1, copy-pasting what others do without the critical thinking. How many times I've heard that sentence, oh, they experiment like that, we should do that too. What this leads to is a situation where you've got a team, let's say it's 4 or 5 people, or let's say it's 200 people, and they have a certain way of working already. And you show up and you say, we should experiment. But what you forget is they're already working in a certain way. Engineers develop software in a certain way. Product managers facilitate with a team a certain way. marketers running their channels, doing their brand stuff in a certain way. And you show up and you say, let's do experimentation. Experimentation is a way of working. It's not just a process that you run on the side. Everybody needs to buy into this stuff. But if you take somebody else's approach that works for their company, and you plug it into your company, I've never really seen that get great. It can be mediocre. There are exceptions where it can be great temporarily, which is a small company that was just founded, just built their first product. Yes, they can often take someone else's approach and run with it for a while, but you have to make it your own. Now, how do you make it your own? Tried a bunch of things. The one that worked well for me was a system map. What's a system map? This is a random example. It's not built around app experimentation. A system map tells you, you got these people, you've got these relationships between the people, they work together in a certain way, they have certain timing, they have certain processes. Okay, that's the way of working today. Then let's take this experimentation approach, let's plug it in. I found that that works quite well. It's also something you can communicate with inside your team. It doesn't matter if it's a big team or a small team. Hey, we have this way of working today. I want to change this piece, that piece, this piece. Oh, okay, makes total sense. So people actually understand that this is a way of working. Now, that's worked for me. There's other ways to do it. I found this one quite helpful. Pattern number 2. Build the process and they will come. You got this vision. Oh, I want to experiment. Back to Mark. He knows how that feels. I've also failed at this myself several times. So you show up, you got this vision, you want to experiment. You go into the teams. Okay, there's a document, there's a process. It starts. You got your kickoff. Oh, you got your weekly meeting. Let's interpret the data together. And then 2-3 months later, it's like, huh? Where'd it go? So it just doesn't exist anymore, or it's happening at a low quality level. But it sounded so good when we did it. What this happens is people put a lot of effort into the experimentation process and the implementation, but they forget the change management. Now, you can do 2 things about that. Number 1, change management is not something that matters for big companies. As I said earlier, I learned a lot through trial and error. I was working at PayPal, pretty big company. I thought change management, something for a 10,000 person plus company. If you're in a startup with 10 people or 20 people, there's stuff in change management that is just as important, but it's just a bit smaller, and it's a bit simpler. But you're still changing how people work. So take change management very seriously. Put a lot of effort into change management if you want to do experimentation, because if you don't, you'll just end up being not what you want it to be. And number 2, which applies to, I'd say, faster growth companies, your team's changing quite a bit. Every now and then you'll have a new joiner, somebody leaves, somebody gets promoted. So you got 1, 2, 3 times a year somebody new coming into the team. You need to onboard them into how you work. And what I've seen companies do, time and time again, they'll onboard them into how do we develop software, how do we do marketing, how do we do this, but then there's no onboarding for how do we do experimentation, what are our belief systems, what are our principles, what are the paradigms that we live with, what are the truths, what history do we have? Do we have 2 years of learnings or 3 months of learnings? Do we have no learnings at all? You got to onboard people, and you have to design the onboarding, and you have to stick to it. It makes the difference between people being productive in a couple of days. They can be productive in their first week if they're already experienced. If you don't do it, they'll struggle. They'll take 2, 3, 4 months to get into it. A hack that worked for me, as an example in one of my last companies, is you get the new joiner to run the process. It's like, congratulations, week 1, here's access to the system. You now run the experimentation process for your team for the next month. It's tough, but they get a good feeling of like, oh, okay, the people work like this in a certain way. It's a great way to hack experimentation onboarding. Now, pattern number 3. This is one of my favorites. I've also failed at this one myself. Lots of shallow answers on why do we experiment. So you ask people in your team, why do we experiment? In my experience, you get one of 2 answers. We need to learn, and some shallow version of that. And number 2, which is a bit more complex, which I only really learned quite recently actually, is there's a lot of focus on quickly iterating on the customer experience, but almost no focus at all on how do we change the direction of the company? How do we get the CEO to know what's going on in the experimentation? How do we use this to make, as a team, the whole company succeed better? So it's not just about iterating on small stuff, also really helping the company win and be much, much better. Now, you can only really do one thing about this, which is you got to start at the top. You got to get your executive team. Doesn't matter if you're a 10-person company where the executive is probably 1 or 2 people, or a 1,000-person company. You got to get their buy-in. You need to talk with them. Like, look, we have this vision about experimentation. We think we can achieve this. We think we can not just iterate and generate more revenue or growth by making the experience better, but we can also generate insights that will help you understand where's the market going. Because they're sitting in an executive team And they're trying to ask themselves, like, where's the market going? It's the experimenters that are running this stuff that they have so much insight on where the market is going, and it's just the information never makes its way up because it gets filtered and filtered and filtered because experimentation is not a way of working in that company. Good example, recently working with a very large virtual reality application. Team experimenting a lot, trying to find out what works. It's a new industry, so you really have to experiment quickly. Then one day, they realize, you need to get the CEO on board with this. And they start sharing with them, like, look, we've got these 10 questions. We've got these 15 hypotheses. We're trying to answer these 4. And this is what we learned when we run the first experiment for 2 weeks. The CEO sitting there is going, oh my God, now I know better where to take the company in the next 12 months. And the team was surprised that that could have that level of impact. So I'd ask you all, don't forget how much you can help your whole company succeed by making sure that your experimentation insights get to the top. That's the answer to why you experiment. It's not just iteration, it's not just improving customer experiences, it's also shaping the future of your company. Where's the market going? This kind of stuff. Now, number 4. I'm a bit biased on this one. As you might have heard by now, I'm kind of obsessed about this stuff. I join companies, or I'm working in a company, because it can also happen in a company when it goes from small to big, that you had an owner and you don't have an owner anymore. Nobody owns the experimentation process. You'll have a super competent engineer, owns delivery, like how does delivery work? You'll have a product manager that's figured out the product development process. You'll have some VP marketing that's figured out, okay, this is how we grow. And you ask, okay, who owns experimentation then? The process, not the whole thing, but just the process. And it's silent. There's very often just not an owner. Now, that will lead to a situation where you can't turn it into a way of working because it will never be good enough. What you want is you want it to be a source of advantage. As a company, you're looking for leverage, you're looking for advantage. You can't have all the advantages, you've got to pick a few. If you pick experimentation and you want it to be an advantage, you need to have an owner. Somebody that wakes up on Monday, or in my case, somebody that wakes up on Sunday and goes, I'm obsessed about this stuff. How do I make the process better next week? Okay, is it the Jira ticket system? Do I need to add another field? Do I need to change the way that the tickets are shown? Or do I need to maybe invest in the way we think about attribution? You become this sort of ambassador, and you need to care a lot about this stuff. That means you need to find an owner. The challenge is, you need somebody that has these kind of traits. I've seen some people try and own it without these traits, and some people that have tried to own it with these traits. There's a pretty big difference in my experience about how good it ends up being. One of the most important ones is intellectual curiosity, somebody that wants to find the truth, because you do experiments, to a large extent, to find some version of the truth. Now, scientists will say, oh, that's not a truth, it wasn't a completely isolated experiment. So it's kind of like a fake truth, but at least it's a truth that's good enough for the company to work with. So you want people that's intellectually curious, you want people that can ask hard questions, that can sit there in front of an executive and go, hey, look, I disagree with your interpretation of these observations. Because you're often discussing interpretation. You got some observations, you got some data, that's not insight yet. Then you need to have the discussion about the interpretation of the data. You can interpret data a lot of different ways. If you have an owner that doesn't ask hard questions, you'll end up with intuition approach instead of logic very often. So you need somebody that asks the hard questions and then also says, are we making intuitive judgment call here, or are we relying on logic, some form of reason? You'll find that a lot of teams, if they don't have that kind of owner, they'll go back to intuition. Intuition can work, but it's the difference between mediocre and great, in my experience. Now, it's hard to find a unicorn, this kind of unicorn profile. I don't meet all these criteria. Diligent and disciplined in preparation? No. Some of the others, I can do a decent job. If you can't find somebody that ticks all the boxes, find somebody that ticks most of the boxes and just get started, because you need to learn about how this works for your company. Don't get hung up on having the perfect owner. Let's have a good enough owner. Now, what does this lead to? When I reflect, I try to turn it into a question, because I need to be able to answer the question to know if I've actually learned something. There's some questions here that you can all ask yourself. So I'll ask you, I have 1 minute, 15 seconds left. I'll ask you, take 30 seconds, read the slide. If the answer is, I don't know, to one of them, or the answer is no, then please put your hand up, and I'm hoping to God that I'm not the worst experimenter here. Yeah, Mark, a good one. So if the answer is no, or I don't know, to one of those questions, then put your hand up. That's one hand, another hand, another hand. Another one, another one, another one, another one. Nice. I'd say you have a lot of opportunity. You can turn it into a source of advantage. It feels amazing to go from okay experimentation to great, because it becomes a source of advantage, becomes something that you can repeat, It becomes a team bonding tool as well, in my experience. And it becomes a way of working for a company. Then they might not be quoting Booking.com back at you in like a couple of years from now. They might quote your company instead. Maybe with Taxfix we get there. That's what I'm trying to do. So I'd say thank you all for coming. This is my obsession about app experimentation processes. P.S. We're also hiring. If you like one of those roles and you think I'm not crazy, then we're looking for someone. You can also talk to Mark in the back. Mark, put your hand up. Mark's also hiring some of these roles. And I'd say, if you have any questions about experimentation, I love talking about this stuff. That's why my email is up there, and my LinkedIn is up there as well. Send me a message, happy to spar. It's fun for me. And I'd say have a nice day.